The silence of deep space was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of a dying distress beacon. The lone vessel, battered and scorched, drifted aimlessly through a desolate sector. Inside, the ship told a grim tale. Its corridors were dim, the once bright lights flickering like dying stars. Panels hung loose, exposing sparking wires. Blood smeared across the walls hinted at the violence that had taken place here. In the heart of the ship, Korea lay slumped against a shattered console. Her breathing was shallow, her armor cracked and burned in places. She was Selfar, a member of a proud warrior race known for their strength and loyalty. But now she was neither strong nor surrounded by allies. Her squad, the ones she had trusted with her life, had turned on her during their mission. Betrayed, ambushed, and left to die, she had barely escaped with her life, only to find herself adrift and alone. The ship's systems were failing. The power core had been damaged during the attack, and the oxygen levels were dropping steadily. Korea's vision blurred as she stared at the emergency console. She had managed to activate a distress beacon before losing consciousness, but she doubted anyone would come. The Selfar were known for their isolationist ways, and the galaxy was full of scavengers who would strip her ship for parts rather than help. Elsewhere, far from the Selthar's abandoned vessel, a human scavenger named Marius sat in the cockpit of his ship. His craft wasn't much to look at. Patches of mismatched metal covered its hull, and the engines often sputtered like they were on the brink of giving up. But it was home. Marius had spent years hopping between debris fields and derelict ships, searching for anything he could salvage and sell. It was a lonely life, but it suited him. The monotony of his day was broken when his scanner pinged. A faint signal appeared on his console, barely noticeable against the background noise of space. Curious, Marius adjusted the scanner and zeroed in on the source. The signal was weak but consistent. A distress beacon. His mind raced as he weighed his options. Distress signals could mean survivors, but they could also mean danger. Pirates often used them as traps. Still, the location was isolated, far from trade routes. It didn't seem like a pirate's usual hunting ground. Well, Marius muttered to himself, it's either a trap, a treasure, or a mystery. He couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. Plotting a course, he engaged the engines and set off toward the signal. When he arrived, the sight of the Selfar vessel made him pause. Its sleek design and sharp angles were unmistakable. Selfar technology was advanced and rare, making it highly valuable. Marius knew this could be a gold mine, but it could also mean trouble. He approached cautiously, scanning for life signs. The results were faint but present. Someone was alive on board. Boarding the vessel, Marius was struck by the eerie silence. His boots echoed against the metal floor as he moved through the ship, flashlights sweeping over the wreckage. He found signs of battle, burn marks from energy weapons, shattered panels, and dried blood. It was clear the crew hadn't gone down without a fight. Finally, he reached the control room and saw her. Korea's imposing figure was unmistakable, even in her weakened state. Her armor, though damaged, still gleamed with the intricate designs of her people. Marius hesitated. Selfar were known to be fierce, even in defeat. Approaching one, especially in a vulnerable moment, could be dangerous. But as he looked closer, he realized she was unconscious, barely clinging to life. "Great," he muttered, kneeling beside her. "Of all the things to find, I get a half-dead alien soldier." Despite his words, he couldn't bring himself to leave her. There was something about her, a quiet defiance, even in her broken state, that struck him. He checked her vitals as best he could, fumbling with her unfamiliar armor until he found a way to loosen it. Beneath the plates, he saw wounds that hadn't been treated, burns, cuts, and bruises. She must have been through hell, he thought. Without wasting more time, he activated his comms and summoned his ship closer. He had basic medical supplies on board, enough to stabilize her, at least for now. Carrying her back to his ship was no easy task. Korea was heavier than she looked, her armor adding extra weight. Marius grumbled under his breath but didn't stop. He laid her on a cot in the cramped medical bay, hooking her up to oxygen and beginning to clean her wounds. As the Sci-Fi ship disappeared behind him, Marius couldn't help but wonder what he had just gotten himself into. His life as a scavenger had taught him to avoid trouble, but now he had brought it on board. Looking at the unconscious warrior, he sighed. "Guess we'll see what kind of mess you bring, huh?" he said quietly. Unbeknownst to Marius, their fates were now intertwined in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The hum of Marius's ship filled the silence as he worked to stabilize Korea. Her alien form lay still on the cot, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, the only sign she was alive. Marius had done what he could with the limited medical supplies on board, but there was only so much he could do. He had no idea what kind of injury or poison she had been exposed to, and his knowledge of Sci-Fi biology was non-existent. Still, he'd done his best. He stood by, watching her carefully. Her skin, once dark and smooth, was marred with burns and bruises, but there was a strange grace to her even in such a state. Her face, framed by short black hair, remained hard and expressionless, as if her pride refused to let her show weakness. Despite the injuries, there was a strength in her presence that Marius couldn't ignore. The ship's systems buzzed, alerting him to a slight change in her vitals. Her breathing steadied, and her temperature dropped back to normal. That was a good sign. Marius sat in the cockpit, keeping an eye on the scanner. His ship wasn't built for long travel, and he couldn't afford to stay out in deep space for too long. He had to make it to the nearest port to get supplies, maybe even find a way to contact someone who could help with her condition. But that meant leaving Korea alone for a while, and that made him uneasy. The thought of leaving a half-dead alien on his ship felt like a bad idea. He didn't know her or her people, and she could easily be a threat. But as he stared at her unconscious form, something made him hesitate. She had been abandoned, betrayed by her own kind. The thought of that kind of cruelty didn't sit well with him. Marius took a deep breath and turned back to the controls. "I'll figure this out," he muttered to himself. "Just need to get you to safety first." Hours passed, and Korea began to stir. A low groan escaped her lips as she shifted on the cot, her body stiff from both the injuries and the unfamiliar surroundings. The first thing she felt was the warmth, the gentle hum of machinery, and the scent of something that wasn't the cold, sterile air of a warship. The second thing was the strange, human voice that filled the silence. "Hey," Marius said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're awake." Korea's eyes fluttered open, but the light in the room was too bright. She squinted, then pushed herself upright in a swift motion. Pain shot through her, and she winced. The armor on her body was loose and unfamiliar, like it had been tampered with. She reached for her weapons, but the usual weight of her energy blades wasn't there. Marius was standing across the room, watching her carefully. He was human, easy to tell from the way he looked and dressed, but he wasn't what she expected. He didn't look afraid. In fact, he looked almost calm. "Don't try anything," Marius said, his voice still calm, "or I'll have to knock you out again." Korea's sharp eyes narrowed as she studied him. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The last thing she remembered was the ambush, the betrayal, the crash, then the darkness. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice hoarse and rough from dehydration. "You're on my ship," Marius replied simply. "I found you drifting in space. You were in pretty bad shape. I did what I could." Korea's gaze turned icy. "I didn't ask for your help, human." Marius raised an eyebrow. "No one asked for it, but I'm not about to leave you to die out there." She struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain, and staggered toward the door. She needed to leave. She couldn't stay here with a human, no matter how much he seemed to want to help. Her honor as a Sci-Fi warrior wouldn't allow it. "Where do you think you're going?" Marius asked, stepping forward to block her path. Korea's eyes flashed with fury. "I have nothing to owe you. I do not need your pity. Marius's expression softened slightly. He wasn't intimidated, but there was something about the alien warrior's tone that made him pause. He could see the pride in her eyes, the deep-rooted belief that she had to stand on her own, that she was never meant to be saved. "You're right," Marius said, taking a step back. "You don't owe me anything. But if you try to go out there in your condition, you'll die. And I don't want that on my conscience." Korea stared at him for a long moment, the silent tension thick in the air. Her breathing was heavy as she stood there, contemplating her next move. She could feel the pain in her body, her strength fading with every passing minute. But her pride, her need for independence, fought against the idea of accepting help from anyone, especially a human. "Fine," she said finally, her voice low and filled with reluctant defeat. "I will rest, but the moment I am able, I will leave." Marius nodded, accepting her decision. "That's fair. Rest up. You're not getting anywhere if you're too weak to move." Korea shot him a glare, but didn't say anything further. She lay back down, closing her eyes. Though she wasn't truly asleep, she was lost in thought, her mind spinning with the situation she found herself in. She had no choice but to accept Marius's aid for now, but that didn't mean she trusted him. Not yet. Marius, meanwhile, stood in the doorway, watching her. He knew this wasn't over, that their uneasy alliance had only just begun, and he had no idea where it would lead. But one thing was certain. It wasn't going to be boring. Days passed, and Korea's strength slowly returned. The human, Marius, she had learned, didn't press her for answers. He didn't ask about her people or why she had been abandoned. In fact, he didn't ask much of anything at all. He simply kept his distance, allowing her to recover at her own pace, and in return, Korea began to trust him in small, uncomfortable ways. It wasn't trust in the human, not truly, but it was trust in the fact that Marius was not actively trying to harm her. She hated the feeling. Still, her situation was dire. Korea had no way to contact the Sulfar fleet. Her ship had been destroyed. Her comrades were either dead or traitors, and there was no way back home. She was stranded, far from everything she had known. And in her moment of desperation, the human had saved her. There was something unsettling about that. "Are you just going to sit there staring at me all day?" Korea finally asked, breaking the silence. Marius had been sitting on the other side of the room, working on the ship's controls, his eyes occasionally flicking over to her. He didn't seem nervous, but he was always watching her. Marius looked up and shrugged. "You're not exactly making it easy for me to talk to you. I've got no clue what's going on with you, but I'm trying to fix this mess. Could use your help, actually." Korea raised an eyebrow. "I don't owe you anything." He smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I don't expect you to. But we're stuck together for now, so you might as well pitch in." "Why are you so kind?" Korea asked, her voice low. "You're human. You don't care about me or my people. You've helped me, but why?" Marius hesitated. He knew this was the moment when most people would give a speech about kindness and doing the right thing. He wasn't that kind of person, though. "I've seen enough in my life to know that it doesn't matter who or what someone is," he said. "I don't do things for reward. If I can help, I do. Simple as that." Korea didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that she didn't understand kindness. Her people had a form of it, but it was rare. In her world, strength was everything, and those who were weak, like her, were discarded. And yet, here was this human, risking his own safety for someone he barely knew. She had no way of understanding it, and that irritated her. The silence grew thick again. After a long while, Marius spoke again. "Look, I've got some supplies, but I need to make a stop at a trading post to get more fuel. We can't stay here much longer. It's dangerous for both of us. There are people out there who wouldn't hesitate to come after you, and they'll come after me too if they know we're together." Korea's gaze sharpened, her instincts flaring. "I don't need your help to survive. I can take care of myself. Marius raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. I know you can, but you're not in any condition to be taking on bounty hunters or whatever else is out there. So what's the plan? Sit here and wait to die? The question hit harder than Korea expected. Her pride flared, but something else stirred inside her. Her warrior spirit refused to admit weakness, but she knew Marius was right. She couldn't afford to stay idle. She needed to find her people, to regain her honor. She stood slowly, ignoring the pain in her body. Fine, she said, her voice still laced with distrust. I'll help, but don't think for a moment that this changes anything between us. I still owe you nothing. Marius chuckled, standing up to face her. I'm not asking for anything. I just need a partner who can hold their own. That was the first time Korea truly saw the depth of Marius's words. He wasn't doing this for some kind of favor. He wasn't looking for gratitude or payment. He simply wanted to survive, just like her. It was a strange feeling, one that made her hesitate for just a moment. Korea nodded curtly. I'll help you with the repairs and supplies, but don't get any ideas about me trusting you. Marius grinned. I wouldn't dream of it. For the next few days, their uneasy alliance settled into something practical. They worked together to fix the ship's damaged systems, scavenging what they could from her vessel and Marius. They even shared a few meals, though the silence between them was still thick. Korea didn't want to let go of the wall she had built around herself, but little by little, she found herself working with the human, not against him. At night, she would sit near the viewport, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. She tried not to think about what had happened to her people. The shame of being abandoned still burned in her chest. She wasn't sure what to do next. Her entire world had been shattered, and she wasn't sure if there was any place for her in it anymore. Marius, on the other hand, had a quiet determination in his eyes. He wasn't looking for anything more than survival, but Korea couldn't help but wonder what else was driving him. Why did he care about someone like her? But there were no answers yet. Only the silence of space and the cold reality of their situation. One thing was clear. They would have to rely on each other if they were going to make it, and that was something neither of them had planned on. Days of working together had done little to ease the tension between Korea and Marius. While the ship's systems were slowly coming back online, the uneasy silence between them remained. Korea would help with repairs, her actions sharp and purposeful, yet her mind never truly engaged with the human. She couldn't afford to trust him. Not fully. Her warrior instincts told her to be wary, to always stay alert. Marius, on the other hand, remained patient. He didn't push Korea for stories or explanations about her people. He simply let her work and kept his distance. His eyes would occasionally flick toward her, but he never asked questions. His ship, after all, was still a mess, and getting it back into proper working condition was more pressing than figuring out what the warrior was really about. They were nearing a small trading outpost when the ship's scanner pinged. An unfamiliar signature appeared, growing stronger. Marius tensed in his seat, quickly analyzing the readings. Looks like we got company, he muttered, eyes narrowing. Korea, still leaning over the engine panel, didn't even flinch. What kind of company? Pirates. Bounty hunters. Whoever they are, they're closing in fast. Marius's fingers flew over the controls as he began evasive maneuvers. The ship lurched, but it was too late. A sudden jolt sent them both tumbling. The ship shook violently as the lights flickered. Korea's hands went to her side instinctively, feeling for weapons that were no longer there. A sharp pain ran through her body as she moved. Her wounds hadn't fully healed, and the strain of the crash made her groan in frustration. Hold on, Marius yelled, his voice tense as he fought to keep the ship on course. Korea clenched her teeth, ignoring the pain. The ship had been hit. The warning lights flashed in red, signaling critical damage. The oxygen levels dropped, and the main engine sputtered in protest. Marius cursed under his breath, cursing the lack of proper shields. He had hoped they could make it to the outpost unnoticed, but the pirates had found them first. Korea's mind raced. She couldn't let the human die. She owed him nothing, but dying with him here, stranded in space, wouldn't restore her honor. She had to act. She lurched to her feet, ignoring the dizziness that swept over her. Staggering to the weapons locker, she threw open the compartment. There were a few old blasters, but nothing like the sleek energy blades she was used to. Grabbing one of the smaller blasters, she adjusted the settings to maximum firepower and made her way toward the door. "Get ready for a fight," Korea called to Marius. Her voice was low but firm. Marius's eyes widened slightly. He had no idea if Korea was capable of handling herself in combat. He had seen her injured and unarmed, but her demeanor was now fierce, almost predatory. "You sure about this?" Marius asked. Korea shot him a look. "I have no intention of dying without a fight." Marius didn't hesitate any longer. He had no choice but to trust her, whether he liked it or not. They had no more time to waste. He quickly accessed the controls, firing off warning signals and trying to juke the ship's trajectory. But the pirates were on their tail. The ship rocked again as a blast hit them, the force sending Korea crashing into the wall. She cursed, rising back to her feet despite the pain. The human was still at the controls, trying to get them out of the enemy's fire range. But they couldn't run forever. Korea could hear the pirates' engines behind them, growing louder. They were closing in fast. She moved quickly, taking the blaster and heading for the out hatch. If they couldn't outrun them, then they'd have to fight. She'd take them down one by one if she had to. Marius turned, seeing Korea moving toward the rear. "Where are you going?" he shouted. "To fight." She threw a quick glance over her shoulder. "Get to the guns. We'll need all the firepower we can get." Marius nodded. There was no time for argument. He grabbed his own weapon, a worn-out plasma rifle, and followed her. They reached the small armory just as another blast rocked the ship, rattling the walls. "We've got 2 enemy ships closing in," Marius said, trying to control his breathing. The panic in his chest was growing, but he forced it down. "Can we hold them off?" Korea's eyes glinted with confidence. "I've faced worse." With the pirate ships drawing closer, Marius took his position by the weapons console, scanning for targets. The flashing red lights made the moment feel like an eternity. He watched as the enemy ships appeared on the visual screens, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the stars. The first shot came. A blast from one of the pirate ships slammed into their hull. The ship shuddered, but Marius and Korea stood firm. They weren't going down without a fight. Marius fired the first shot, hitting one of the pirate ships dead on. The blast sent it veering off course. But it wasn't enough to stop the others. Korea, meanwhile, was focused on the other ship. She took steady aim, her pulse quickening as she squeezed the trigger. The energy pulse from her blaster lit up the darkness, striking the second pirate ship's engines and causing it to burst into flames. "Yes," Marius shouted, a grin spreading across his face. But they weren't out of danger yet. A third ship had appeared, its weapons locked on them. It was much larger than the others, and Korea's heart sank. "We need to get out of here," she said. "That one's too big. We won't win this fight." Marius's fingers flew over the console, but the pirate ship was closing in. "Hold on," he yelled. "We're not done yet." The ship's engines roared to life, but it wasn't fast enough. The pirate ship's cannons fired, hitting them with a blast that rocked the whole ship. For a moment, everything went dark. Korea's world spun as she was thrown across the room. She fought to stay conscious, her body battered from the impact. This wasn't over. Not yet. Through the pain, she heard Marius's voice, urgent but filled with determination. "Stay with me, Korea. We're getting out of this." The darkness was overwhelming. The harsh sound of alarms echoed through the ship, blending with the crackling of damaged circuits. Korea's head throbbed as she tried to push herself up from the cold, metallic floor. Her limbs were stiff, and the weight of her body felt like 1,000 pounds, but the immediate need to survive pushed all other thoughts aside. She could not let herself fall into the void. Marius's voice broke through the haze. "Karita, you with me?" Karita blinked, slowly regaining her bearings. She was still on the ship, the walls around her shaking violently as the pirates' cannons continued to strike. The lights flickered, casting brief moments of shadow across the small control room. The damage from the blast was severe, but the human had not given up. She could hear him moving nearby, his voice urgent but steady. "I'm here," she replied, gritting her teeth against the pain. "What happened?" "I'm trying to keep us in one piece," Marius answered, his voice strained. "We got one more shot at this, Karita. We need to get to the engine room. Now." She didn't hesitate. Pain shot through her, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to be weak. She forced herself to her feet, her mind focused on the one goal: survival. Her fingers found her blaster once again, gripping it tightly. The ship was still holding together, but the next blast could tear it apart. With careful steps, Karita moved toward Marius, who was already making his way toward the back of the ship. The ship shuddered again as another blast hit, and the floor beneath them rattled. "Hold on," Marius shouted, grabbing her arm to steady her. "We need to make it to the escape pods if this doesn't work. That's our only option." Escape pods. Karita's eyes narrowed. "No, we fight." Marius's eyes met hers. There was determination in his gaze, but also something more, something deeper. "We can't fight all of them. There's too many. We don't have the firepower, but we can make sure they don't leave with the ship intact." Karita clenched her jaw, her mind racing. It was true. They were outnumbered, and the ship's systems were failing. But there had to be a way. There was always a way. "Fine," she said finally. "Let's make sure they regret attacking us." They reached the engine room, where the ship's power core hummed dangerously. The massive engines were flickering on and off, struggling to keep the ship in motion. Marius moved quickly, his hands flying over the console as he tried to get the system back online. Karita stood guard, watching through the small viewport as the pirate ship loomed closer. It was massive, its guns aimed directly at them. She gripped the blaster in her hand tighter. She had no choice but to trust Marius. He wasn't wrong. The odds were stacked against them, but she had been in worse situations, and somehow she had survived. She wasn't going to die here, not in the cold, empty void of space. "Almost there," Marius said, his voice focused. His fingers danced across the console, pressing buttons and flipping switches. The ship's systems began to hum louder, the engines sputtering back to life. The pirate ship fired again, the blast hitting their ship's outer hull. Karita gritted her teeth as the force of the impact threw her against the wall. The ship groaned in protest, and smoke began to billow from one of the power conduits. "We need to hurry," Marius said. "They're going to breach us if we don't get out of here." Karita didn't need to be told twice. She raised her blaster and fired at the pirate ship's outer shields. The blast hit the shield, causing it to shimmer and crackle. It wasn't much, but it was enough to slow them down. Marius worked furiously, muttering to himself as he rerouted power from the damaged sections of the ship. The humming of the engines grew stronger, and Karita could feel the ship starting to gain speed again. "Good," Marius said, looking up at her. "We're moving faster. But it's not enough. We need to buy some time. Can you hold off their fire for just a little longer?" Karita's eyes flashed with determination. "You worry about the engines. I'll handle the pirates." She moved toward the rear of the ship, where the weapons console was located. Her fingers moved swiftly over the controls, bringing the ship's defensive cannons online. The weapons were old, damaged from the earlier attacks, but they would do the job. She aimed at the pirate ship, focusing on the areas where she could cause the most damage: their weapon systems, their shields. The pirate ship fired again, the impact rattling the ship once more. Korea gritted her teeth and fired back. The first shot hit the pirate ship's shields, causing them to flicker. She fired again, this time hitting one of the pirate ship's weapon systems. The explosion was enough to send sparks flying, and Korea smirked. That's right. She wasn't finished yet. The pirate ship returned fire, but this time, their shots were slower, weaker. Korea knew they were trying to assess the damage. They were no longer as confident. The pressure was starting to shift. Marius's voice came over the comms. Good work. I've got the engines back online. We can outrun them now. Korea's heart pounded in her chest. She kept firing, each shot hitting its mark, slowly wearing down the pirate ship's systems. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they had a chance. The pirate ship fired one last desperate shot. Korea barely managed to dodge it, the blast passing inches from her. The force of the explosion sent a shockwave through the ship, throwing her back. She hit the wall hard, the pain making her vision blur. But before she could fall unconscious, she heard Marius's voice once again. Hang on, Korea. We're almost there. We're getting out of this. And for the first time since they had met, Korea allowed herself to believe it. They might actually survive this. The ship's tremors began to ease as Marius pushed the throttle forward, gaining more distance between them and the pirate ship. But Korea knew it wasn't over. Not yet. She could still feel the heavy presence of the enemy behind them, even though they were gaining speed. Every second counted now. One wrong move, one wrong shot, and they would be caught again. She slowly rose to her feet, wincing from the pain that shot through her side. The blast earlier had left a bruise across her ribs, and her body still hadn't fully healed. But there was no time for weakness. Not now. Marius's voice crackled through the comms, steady but filled with tension. We're still not clear. I need to get the shields up. If we don't do that, we'll be sitting ducks. Then do it, Korea replied firmly. Her voice lacked the usual coldness. But it didn't matter. They had bigger problems. I'll keep watch. Marius didn't argue. He was already working on the shield systems, flipping switches and tapping commands into the control panel. Korea watched him for a moment. The human was clearly exhausted, his face pale from the effort. But there was a kind of calmness in him now, a determination she hadn't seen before. It was strange, but there was something almost comforting about it. She shook her head, clearing her thoughts. She didn't have time to be distracted. She moved to the cockpit, her eyes scanning the dark void of space. The pirate ship was still in pursuit, but it was slowly falling behind. They'd taken a hit, but they hadn't been completely disabled. They had to act fast. A sudden blip on the sensor made her freeze. It was small, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the stars, but it was definitely there. Another ship. Marius. Korea shouted, her heart leaping in her chest. We've got another one. Marius didn't hesitate. His fingers flew over the controls as he switched to evasive maneuvers, sending the ship into a sharp turn. Korea grabbed the back of the seat to steady herself. The ship bucked beneath her, the engines straining as they tried to outrun the two pursuing pirate ships. This one's bigger, Marius muttered, his voice tight. They're trying to flank us. We can't outrun them for long. Korea's mind raced. She had fought enemies before, many enemies, but never like this. She was used to being on the offensive, used to controlling the situation. But now she was a fugitive, a warrior without her fleet, without her weapons, and without the advantage she had once taken for granted. The human was her only ally. And right now, he was doing everything he could to keep them alive. Can you hold them off? Marius asked, his voice focused. He didn't look at her, but she could hear the unspoken question in his tone. Can you help me? She didn't hesitate. I'll do what I can. Keep the engines running. Marius nodded quickly and turned back to the controls. As he did, Korea moved toward the rear of the ship again, taking position at the weapons console. She had no idea how much power the ship's guns had left, but it didn't matter. She would make it work. She aimed at the approaching pirate ship, her fingers pressing the fire button. A single shot rang out, but it barely did any damage. The enemy ship's shields held firm. She swore under her breath. They were strong. Too strong. The ship shuddered again as Marius dodged another blast. "We can't keep this up," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. Korea's eyes narrowed. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She knew her skills better than anyone. She could take down their shields. She had to. "Trust me," Korea said, her voice steady. "I'll get their shields down. Just keep the ship moving." Marius didn't reply. He was too busy focusing on the ship's controls. Korea didn't need his approval. She knew what she had to do. She recalibrated the weapon systems, boosting the power to their energy cannons. This wasn't a perfect solution, but it would have to do. The pirate ship was getting closer, their weapons primed for another shot. Korea adjusted the targeting system and fired again. This time, the blast hit the enemy ship's shields directly, causing them to flicker. A spark of hope flared in Korea's chest, but it was brief. The shields were still holding, and the pirate ship was coming in for another attack. She gritted her teeth and fired once more, this time at a different angle. The blast hit the lower section of the ship, and there was a brief flash of light. The shields weakened, just enough to make a difference. Marius's voice came through the comms, his tone urgent. "Now, Korea. Hit them again." Korea didn't need to be told twice. She fired, aiming straight for the pirate ship's engines. This time, she didn't hold back. The blast struck the pirate ship with a violent explosion, sending shockwaves through the space around them. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then, the pirate ship's engines began to sputter. The once confident vessel now struggled to maintain its position. It was damaged, and Korea could feel the tide turning. Marius's voice crackled through the comms, his voice full of relief. "Nice shot. They're disabled. One down." Korea allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. They had one more ship to deal with, and that one was still coming fast. She moved back to the cockpit, her hand steady on the weapons console. The remaining pirate ship was closing in fast, but now they had the advantage. She would make sure they didn't lose it. "We got this," she said, more to herself than to Marius. "Just get us out of here." Marius didn't respond. His face was tight with focus as he piloted the ship toward an asteroid field ahead. They could hide there, use the rocks for cover. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance. As the pirate ship fired once more, Korea readied herself. The battle wasn't over, but as the asteroid field loomed closer, she felt a surge of confidence. They could do this. Together. The asteroid field loomed ahead, a dense cloud of rocks floating in space like a deadly maze. The pirate ship was right on their tail, relentless in its pursuit. Korea gripped the weapons console with both hands, her knuckles white. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was it, the final battle. There was no running anymore. They had to make their stand here. Marius's voice came through the comms, calm but filled with determination. "Get ready, Korea. We need to use these asteroids as cover. We've got one shot at this." Korea didn't need to hear more. She could see the pirate ship closing in, its guns charging for another shot. She aimed their weapons at the enemy ship's hull, targeting weak points she had observed earlier. The pirate ship had taken some damage, but it was still dangerous. Too dangerous. "Steady," she murmured to herself, her finger hovering over the fire button. The enemy ship's cannons lit up, and the blast rocketed toward them. The ship lurched as Marius veered sharply to the left, dodging the shot just in time. The blast barely missed, but it sent debris scattering through space, clinking off the hull. "Nice move," Korea said, her voice low and focused. "We can't keep dodging forever," Marius replied, his face tight with concentration. We need to get behind one of these asteroids and hit them hard. Korea nodded. She understood. The asteroids weren't just their cover. They were their weapon. She could fire from behind them, using the rocks to shield them from the pirates' guns. But timing was everything. The pirate ship fired again, but this time, Korea was ready. She pushed the button, unleashing a powerful blast from their guns. The shot hit the pirate ship's shields, causing them to flicker for a moment before stabilizing. "Shields down to 50%, Marius muttered, eyeing the readout. "But they're still not backing off." Korea's eyes narrowed. The pirate ship was relentless, but so was she. They couldn't keep fighting like this. They had to end it. "Get us closer to that asteroid," she said. "I'll take it from here." Marius didn't hesitate. He turned the ship toward the large asteroid ahead, flying just close enough to use it as cover. The pirate ship followed them, thinking it could get close enough for another shot. But that's when Korea made her move. The moment the pirate ship came within range, she fired again. This time, the blast hit the enemy ship's engines, causing a violent explosion. The ship jerked violently, its forward momentum faltering. Marius's eyes lit up with hope. Yes, they're losing power. But before they could celebrate, the pirate ship fired one final blast, sending it careening toward them. The ship's hull shuddered from the impact, and warning lights flashed across the control panel. "Hold on," Marius shouted, gripping the controls with all his strength. Korea's instincts kicked in. She moved toward the rear of the ship, grabbing the remaining weapon and aiming it out the viewport. She could see the pirate ship's final move. Its guns were locked on them. Korea fired first. She hit the pirate ship's guns, disabling one of its cannons. The pirate ship responded with another blast, but this time it missed. The asteroid field gave them just enough cover. "Just a little longer," Korea muttered, her teeth gritted. She could see the pirate ship's shields flickering as it struggled to maintain control. Marius swerved again, dodging the incoming fire. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're close," he said, his voice tight with effort. Korea glanced at him. Seeing the strain on his face, she knew he was pushing himself to his limits, but there was something in his eyes. A spark, a determination that matched her own. The pirate ship fired one last desperate shot, but this time, Korea was prepared. She fired back with everything they had, using all the power she could muster. The shot hit the pirate ship's main engine, causing it to explode in a fiery burst. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the pirate ship spun out of control, its engines gone. It drifted into the vastness of space, its once menacing form now a floating wreck. "We did it," Marius breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. Korea stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the wreckage of the pirate ship. They had survived. They had fought together, and they had won. Despite all the odds, they had made it out alive. But there was no time to relax. The ship was damaged, and they still had to get to safety. Korea turned toward Marius, her expression hardening once more. "We're not done yet. We need to get to that trading outpost. And we need to move fast." Marius nodded, already turning the ship toward the outpost. "Right. We're not out of danger yet." As the ship drifted into the safety of the asteroid field, Korea took a deep breath. The battle was over, but their journey wasn't. They had proven they could rely on each other, that they could fight together. But the universe was vast, and there were still many dangers ahead. For now, though, they had earned a brief moment of peace. Korea turned to Marius, a small smirk crossing her face. "Next time, I'll let you do all the fighting." Marius looked at her, surprised. Then his lips curled into a grin. "Deal. But only if you promise not to throw me into any more battles like that." Korea's smile was rare, but genuine. "I can't promise that. The universe is dangerous, but with you at my side, I think we'll make it." As they drifted toward the distant outpost, a new chapter of their unlikely partnership began. They had survived the impossible, and together they would face whatever came next.